On Production is brought to you by Wrapbook, the production industry's only on-demand payroll platform. With Wrapbook, you can pay your crew with a click and track all your costs in real time, all in one place. To find out more about how Wrapbook is transforming the way productions pay their crews, visit wrapbook.com. Welcome to On Production, brought to you by Wrapbook. Today, I'm delighted to have Steve Caplan with me. Steve is a luminary in strategic communications and marketing, and the founder of Message. With a career spanning roles such as senior advisor at the United Nations Climate Change Conference and executive vice president at the Association of Independent Commercial Producers, Steve has been a pivotal figure in addressing complex policy issues through innovative communication strategies. Today, he's with me to share his insights on leveraging media for social change and his journey through the dynamic landscape of strategic communication. Steve, thanks for joining me on Production.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So first off, share with me what inspired you to found Message and how your background in political science and government really influenced your approach to strategic communication and policy strategy.
Yeah, thanks for that. You know, I've had a really interesting career, and I appreciate some of the items you ticked off there. And I've really spent the entirety of my career, especially my early career, sort of straddling the two worlds of entertainment and politics. And I began my career, I'm from LA, born and raised in Los Angeles. And I grew up at a time in Los Angeles where all my neighbors were in and of the production industry. The guy across the street showed up on Chips as a cast member. My friends down the street had great skateboard ramps because their dads worked on set. It goes on and on. Even my father, Gary Caplan, was sort of an innovator in the licensing and entertainment licensing world. So I grew up in and around production. So I want to tell you first, before we talk about message and strategic communications, how important production is to me and the industry. It's something that I love and care very much about and spent a good amount of time working in production as well. So I came from the world of sort of Los Angeles, just over in the Valley. And my real passion as a young person and then through my early career was working in politics. I went out to Iowa when I was 21 years old, took 24 units in 10 weeks to go work on the Iowa caucus. I got a job offer to go out to Iowa and work on a campaign, in the presidential campaign, for a candidate who didn't last, but is in the White House now. And my folks said, no, you can't go. You haven't graduated. You can't go to Iowa. And I said, well, I'm going. They said, well, you better graduate first. So I took 24 units in 10 weeks, which was a lot for anyone who knows I was at a UC system. So, you know, my interest has always been politics and also entertainment and storytelling. So all those things have driven me in my career. And through a number of really, unbelievable opportunities, and including my time at the AICP, where I spent, I think, 6-7 years, maybe longer, helping to build the industry, I was able to learn and see a lot about creativity, about the power of a message, about how important it is to deliver that message creatively. And also during my time at GMMB, where I was a partner, an agency based out of DC, and I was a partner at GMMB, and I was fortunate enough to be kind of ringside for the Obama for America presidential campaign in 2008. I think I was able to see over the years how important the combination of a really powerful message and delivering that message well through communications, through creativity, is a path to success professionally and in business. And that was where the idea of Message came. And so I launched Message in 2011, have taken on a whole number of great clients, including Comcast, NBC Universal, with whom I've worked for many years. Sutter Health was a client. I worked with a lot of folks, big and small, and was able to bring a lot of creative partners to bear on the work that we did, not just from a PR and messaging standpoint, but creatively. Picked up a couple of awards, including the Ad Age Modern Healthcare Campaign of the Year and some other stuff. So it's been a journey, but at the foundation of my entire professional experience, I think, has been the importance of the power of a message. And when I picked the name, there it was. If you don't mind, I'm going to give you a story real quick about my name, the brand. Is that okay?
Yeah, it's wonderful.
So I started Message. I had this notion of building a brand around the power of that term for strategic communications. We'll talk more about that. And I went and I did a search. I forget what they call it. We searched on the state's database, and I saw that the name Message was taken. Oh, and my dream is over. I'm going to have to call it Message-ish or Message-like. And I look at the name on Message, and it said Michael Remersa. Now, Michael Remersa may predate you and your time in the industry, but Michael was a member of my board at the AICP. Michael Remersa had Bedford Falls, the production company. It was a great, and is, I suspect still continues in the business. And I said, wow, this is kismet. I'm going to call Michael Remersa. And sure enough, I called their company. And Nancy Novakment was the CFO at the time. And Nancy said, well, yeah, that's a company we set up for a director. If you want it, it's yours.
Wow.
And what does that tell you?
What a small world. Isn't it interesting in a career, these moments just kind of appear that almost make it seem as if it was already written down in stone, you know?
It definitely was a surprise and one of those wonderful experiences where you're like, oh man, I had this great idea and it was taken, and you never know where it takes you. So I encourage people as they're navigating new turfs, new times, to keep an open mind. But that was sort of a fun little story, which I'm not sure I've ever shared because it really wasn't relevant in many instances other than our conversation, talking about our commercial production friends.
It's so funny. You know, Steve, I actually want to go back to something you were touching on related to kind of your broader experience in your career. You've worked in a lot of different industries, both public and private. I'm curious, based off of your experience, what are some key principles that you believe are crucial for effective advocacy today, whether in the public space or in the private markets?
First and foremost, I teach as well at USC, and that's something, that I started in 2019. I teach Introduction to Advertising, Social Media Marketing. I'm teaching a course in political advertising this year. And teaching has really been one of the most incredible professional opportunities in my life. I teach at the Annenberg School at USC and love doing it. And it gives me a chance to think about what shapes effective communication. And at the end of the day, and we can talk about advocacy as a tactic, right? Advocacy can be a way of getting a message out. But my point of view is that strategy is what matters most. Strategy is what should drive everything. And I think that too often companies and advocates start with a goal and objective and don't really spend a lot of time thinking about that strategically. All right, we're going to pass a bill. We're going to get X done. Well, what's the strategy to get there? And why is that our goal? So I really believe that regardless of the tactic, you have to have a strategy first. And in fact, I'm working on a book called Strategy First. So I encourage you all we'll talk hopefully at the end of the show, we can talk more about that. But the notion is that you have to have effective advocacy, you need to develop and determine a strategy. I can talk about one moment, an instance that may be interesting to your viewers. Years ago, we had a very small, tiny program at the state of California called Film California First. Many commercial producers of the older generation will remember it because it was an opportunity to access some incentives for the commercial industry. And when we thought about that bill, the leadership at AICP and all of our board, we were like, well, what can we do that's going to get money in our pockets? That was it isn't just to get an incentive for incentive, because sometimes these credits you have to have a taxable income. They're very complicated. But we were able to create a piece of legislation that was very inexpensive for the state that actually put money directly back in the form of cash rebates to producers. And the members loved it. Our strategy was to not roll with the studios who had different objectives and goals, but to create our own sort of little lane. And we, in terms of advocacy, came up with strategies around talking about small business, vendors and suppliers, and created a sort of message that supported our strategy. So, it's really about determining what your strategy is. And I think right now, many businesses who are challenged by the emergence of AI, technology changes, budget, they need to start thinking, okay, what's our strategy here? So I look at everything through a very strategy first prism. And that's what I teach my students. And we can talk about how advocacy works and how it can be done effectively, but it really depends on what you're trying to achieve.
Absolutely. That's really insightful. I think it leads very nicely into what I was hoping to kind of address for our listenership here. Obviously at Rapbook, we're all about film craft, project-based work, and many of Rapbook's customers are some of the greatest film organizations in the world. And they really care about policy and labor and the future of the commercial production industry. And there's no one really better to speak to you about that than you, Steve. And so I'm curious though, I mean, I know that your tenure at AICP has since ended, but you're still very tight and close with this industry. But during your tenure as executive vice president at AICP, I'm curious, what were some pivotal changes or challenges in the commercial production industry that you helped address?
I came to AICP. This is going to be my stroll down memory lane a little bit, and I'll drop some names and mention some people just because it's fun. I mean, I came from politics. Okay, I was running political campaigns. In addition to working in Iowa, I was a political director for a guy named Ed Rendell. I served in his administration, even though I'm from Sherman Oaks, worked in Philadelphia. It was deputy mayor there. And Pam Tar, who was a music video producer and the wonderful, talented producer, brought me out to LA. I was in LA. I got recruited for this job. I showed up for a couple of meetings at RSA and over at Radical Media and Frank Sherman, Frank Stiefel. And I showed up for my interviews wearing a blue blazer and a khaki pants and a button-down shirt. And I think they looked at me like I was from Mars. I didn't know. And I show up and there's dogs running around.
It's a very different industry than political advocacy.
Different. But as I said, I grew up in LA and I'm familiar with it, but I had no sort of sense of it. But what struck me immediately was just how creative the industry was. This is, frankly, even before, we have to talk in terms of, unfortunately, in the last 2 decades, recession point moments and major moments of change. Things like the recession of 2008, and then, of course, the 9/11. We've had some real trauma in our industry and in our lives. But when I came to AICP and when I came to the commercials industry, it was a really good time. I'm not going to lie. Creatively, in terms of financially, I think the businesses were doing quite well. And really the biggest difference from the beginning of my tenure to the end, and it happened fast, was the emergence of digital media. It changed everything. And the reason that commercials for many years could be as successful as they were in the commercials industry and as profitable, frankly, was that advertisers had fewer choices to make when it came to producing and buying media.
That there was higher literally technical barriers of entry.
The higher technical barriers of entry. So on the technical side, the ability and the changes on the technology, Kodak was our biggest vendor, think about that, right? Film. And so film was still huge when I started. And I know it sounds like I'm in the Stone Ages, but it wasn't that long ago. It was not. And we saw the change to digital. So on the technology platform side, there was a massive change, which probably had a lot of cost impacts, production and post impacts. But on the distribution side, you started to see where advertisers were like, okay, we've got a moment with primetime advertising, with must-see TV, and we're going to make an ad for a new brand. We're going to put a lot of money into that ad, and because 15 million people are going to be watching it, we know they're going to be there, to several years later in the early 2000s, where those ads were being seen on digital platforms, created in different ways, finished in different ways, and the media buys were different. So I think that the industry had to adapt and change, and it has. I think that change came a little bit slowly, but we did some really cool things. I think the question was sort of, what did we do to address those? Well, I was very involved with Matt Miller and a lot of other great folks at AICP in creating an entity that we called AICP Next, which continues, I believe, to sort of be a vital part of the AICP's work. But the whole objective there was to sort of talk about, well, what are we going to do when all these things change? And that was a lot of the early work we did. And on the labor side, people like Jane Nunez and Matt Miller were trying to keep an eye on how those changes would affect our labor contracts, which I think was another interesting issue. And I think the unions are still, frankly, struggling with. And I hope they get that resolved. That's a whole nother issue, which I'm happy to talk about. But I think that was probably, from a business standpoint, the biggest change in the 7 years that I was there was the movement from, traditional production using film and all the technologies that existed to where we are and got to it around the mid to late 2000s. But more importantly, in some ways, for the industry, what it meant for the amount of content that needed to be created and how it would get created and how people would get compensated for it.
Right. That's the interesting thing about the digital proliferation is that the technical barriers of entrance of actually making technical film that had high craft and high value and was entertaining to watch, it went down. But then also the proliferation of screens and the amount of time that could be spent engaging with media increased exponentially. So you have this totally interesting sort of dynamic. And something that I've observed, Steve, is like, these cheaper forms of content work for a little while, and then consumers seem to get bored of it. And they want more film craft, more novelty, more like rich film narrative craft and novelty as these distribution methods kind of mature out. And so it's been an interesting thing. It used to be, and you can still like see many millions of hours of screen time going to random YouTube content. But at the actual bleeding edge, though, you look at somebody like Mr. Beast, he's spending millions of dollars per production and is the definite winner on that platform. So it is interesting to see how these things are playing out even now compared to when you were dealing with it as a sort of an emergent phenomenon in the industry.
We always have a tendency to say and to think to ourselves, well, the end is near, the good times are over. And that was, certainly a fear from some people, not all of the people in the commercials industry, that digital technology would change the way the business ran and that the margins would go down. A lot of concerns about the business. But in each turn, there were always people in the industry who said, no, this is an opportunity and there is more content being made. And what people need to see is, content that could cut through, that looks good, that's persuasive. And I think the agencies are doing a pretty good job of that in some cases. And the creators, though, the creator economy is real. And it's changed that dynamic. I would say that, even as we think about AI, and I'm spending quite a bit of time talking and writing about that on a blog Substack, which I encourage all your readers to follow, called Control Alt Persuade. And we can talk more about that a little bit if you're interested. Talking about the importance of AI, a lot of the concern right now is about things like deep fakes and in the political and public policy world, and even in entertainment, we saw the Scarlett Johansson concern with chat using her voice. And I think producers and vendors need to think about, okay, strategically, how are we going to benefit from this? How do we make sure we're not the last man standing or the last group standing or the last people standing? And I think that's where the challenge is going to be. A lot of people will probably think about, well, how can we use these tools to streamline processes, which is a good thing, but I'm not sure that's the question. It's about relevance. How does our business and our industry stay relevant at a time when the filmmaking craft is going to change? And I actually think there's a lot of relevance for producers. They just need to think strategically.
I do think we should dig in on this, Steve. So at the time of this recording, the AICP just hosted its sort of annual AICP week. And the topic on everyone's minds was generative AI, generative AI, generative AI. So as the commercial production landscape evolves, we talked about digital film craft and its repercussions on the industry that we're still feeling now. Let's extend that past just digital cameras, digital workflow software, and expand the scope of the conversation to generative AI and the fact that you've been thinking about this. What advice are you giving today's producers to stay relevant and to stay successful given this massive sea change? And by the way, I know that people in the industry, our industry, the film business, are quite curious. Some are scared, some are excited. But what's fascinating about this moment is it is applicable to every industry. Software development, medicine, law, things that I'm not even thinking about. Across dinner tables globally, I think professionals, knowledge workers are talking about this and wondering what the ramifications will be.
The commercial production industry specifically, I have some thoughts.